There are certain truths the soul can only learn through ruin. You don't realize it when it begins, the slow unraveling, the quiet decay of your certainty. You simply love someone too deeply, trust too completely, give too much until one day you look in the mirror and cannot find yourself in your own eyes. That is where Jung said the alchemy begins, not in light or revelation, but in the disorienting darkness that follows betrayal. He believed that when empathy meets manipulation and survives, something extraordinary, something dangerous is born. What he called the final stage of the empath was not about healing. It was about becoming something the world has rarely seen, a consciousness immune to deception, yet still capable of love. Emma's story began, as most do, with collapse. In Jung's private notes, she was 34, fragile. Her sense of self dissolved into the emotional weather of everyone around her. The world had become porous. She could feel other people's pain as vividly as her own, but she could no longer locate where she ended and they began. Jung wrote that she wept without knowing whose sorrow she carried. To him, she was not merely ill. She was becoming the raw material of transformation. The narcissists in her life, those cold suns she orbited, had stripped her of everything that was not essential. He watched as her identity, her self-image, her ideals of goodness, all burned away until only the bare essence remained. He called it psychic death. But death to Jung was never the end. It was the furnace of rebirth. He saw that in M's suffering, the unconscious had chosen a violent teacher. The narcissist, he said, serves as the dark priest of the empath's initiation, destroying the false so that the true may emerge. Under his guidance, M began to see that every cruelty reflected something within her that she had refused to see. The manipulation mirrored her own quiet need to control. The lies reflected her own fear of honesty. The coldness she despised revealed the numbness she had long buried beneath kindness. Jung called this the confrontation with the shadow, and he warned that it was not for the faint of heart. One does not become enlightened, he wrote, by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. M was learning painfully to do exactly that. Over 2 years, the metamorphosis took shape in silence. Jung noted that her gaze changed first. She no longer looked outward for reassurance, but inward for alignment. He described her eyes as depths through which no deception could pass unnoticed. She began to choose when to feel and when to observe. Her compassion remained, but it no longer consumed her. She could hold another's suffering like a fragile flame in her hands without letting it scorch her palms. This, Jung wrote, was conscious permeability, the art of remaining open without being invaded. For the first time in her life, M felt everything and lost nothing of herself. It frightened those around her. Friends whispered that she had become distant, cold. But Jung saw it differently. He said she had simply ceased mistaking enmeshment for love. Through this transformation, Jung discovered what he later called sovereign empathy, the rarest and most dangerous form of human awareness. It was empathy purified through the fire of shadow empathy that no longer sought approval, rescue, or redemption. M was not healed in the conventional sense. She was transfigured. Her sensitivity had survived, but it had evolved into mastery. Jung believed such individuals had stepped beyond the reach of manipulation entirely, and yet they often found themselves unbearably alone. To see too clearly is to stand apart from the world that still prefers its illusions. For M, that was the beginning of another kind of trial, the loneliness of those who can no longer unsee. Isolation. Jung wrote, is not always the enemy. Sometimes it is the chrysalis that guards transformation. But for those like M, it was not chosen, it arrived as consequence. The same clarity that freed her also divided her from the familiar world. Family and friends felt her change as distance. She no longer absorbed their moods, no longer performed the role of caretaker, and so they mistook her calm detachment for coldness. Yet within her, something sacred had begun to unfold. Where once there was the compulsion to please, there now lived a quiet sovereignty. She had stopped bleeding for others. She had learned the difference between love and self-erasure. Jung watched this with awe and unease. In his journals, he called it dangerous knowledge, for he realized that when an empath survives annihilation, they do not simply heal, they evolve into a consciousness that no longer fits the social order built on projection and denial. M's insight into human motives had sharpened into something uncanny. She could sense deception before words were spoken. She could trace emotional manipulation the way a sailor reads the wind. Yet her response was no longer anger or self-defense, it was understanding. This, Jung said, was the mark of integration, when one can see darkness clearly without being drawn into it. But such vision carries its own sorrow. M confessed to Jung that she could no longer engage in ordinary conversation. Every small talk, every polite smile seemed layered with invisible machinery defense mechanisms, unmet needs, hidden fears. It's like seeing the scaffolding behind every facade, she told him. I know too much to pretend anymore. Jung called this the consciousness gap, the unbridgeable distance between those who have faced their shadow and those who still run from it. To live in that gap is to feel like a ghost among the living awake, among dreamers who cannot yet bear to wake. He recognized in her the ancient archetype of the prophet, the one who sees too deeply and is cast out for it. Throughout history, he noted humanity has feared its seers, not because they lie, but because they see. He called it the prophet's isolation, the inevitable loneliness of those who perceive truth beyond the collective comfort. Even in his clinical notes, Jung's tone faltered between reverence and apprehension. He wondered if this evolution came at too high a price. To achieve sovereign empathy was to gain mastery over one's inner world, but to lose the easy warmth of belonging. The garden of unconscious innocence was forever closed. Still, M did not regret her transformation. I would rather see clearly and walk alone, she said to him once, than live blind among those who pretend. Jung underlined the sentence 3 times. It haunted him, this quiet courage born from devastation. He began to suspect that such individuals were not accidents of psychology, but forerunners of something greater, a new form of human consciousness. They were what he called bridges between the personal and the archetypal, able to hold both pain and wisdom in equal measure. For young M's metamorphosis confirmed a terrifying beauty that trauma could be a crucible for evolution. The narcissist's cruelty, he wrote, functions as a shadow initiation. Through it, the empath confronts every illusion about goodness, love, even the self. In that confrontation, the old self must die. Only through annihilation does authenticity emerge. The empath who endures becomes something that cannot be deceived because they have faced the deceiver within. M's presence, he wrote, changed the very atmosphere of the room, not because she sought to influence others, but because she no longer needed to. Her silence had weight. Her compassion, once desperate, had become steady as light. She feels the depths of others, Jung wrote, but she does not drown in them. He had never witnessed such psychological sovereignty before. It left him both inspired and unsettled. For if this was the future of human consciousness, it meant evolution would demand the destruction of all that once defined empathy itself. Jung began to see a pattern that stretched far beyond M. He found echoes of her transformation in other patients, in myths, even in his dreams. The empath's journey, he realized, was nothing less than an archetypal drama, the descent into darkness and the return bearing light. Every empath who endured the crucible of narcissistic abuse faced the same threshold to be destroyed by their own sensitivity or to be reborn through it. He called this process the 3 deaths. First, the death of innocence, when the empath realizes that goodness alone cannot protect them. Second, the death of illusion, when they see that love cannot fix those who choose not to change. And finally, the death of dependence, when they release the need for validation, approval, or understanding from those who cannot give it. These deaths were not metaphors to Jung, they were initiations. He wrote that the empath's heart becomes the vessel of alchemy where poison is transmuted into medicine. The narcissist, in all their unconscious cruelty, becomes the unwitting catalyst for this transformation. They drag the empath into the underworld of the psyche where all masks fall away. Down there, stripped of identity and ideals, the empath meets what Jung called the shadow self, the part they had always denied: their anger, pride, desire for control, and need to be seen. To survive, they must face it not with denial or guilt, but with acceptance. Only then can they integrate it. M's story mirrored this descent perfectly. In her darkest hour, she stopped asking, "Why did this happen to me?" and began asking, "What in me answered this call?" That question marked the beginning of her sovereignty. She saw that the same empathy that once drew predators was now the instrument of discernment. Her sensitivity, once her curse, became her compass. She could feel manipulation as clearly as heat, but now it no longer burned her, it simply informed her. Jung wrote that this was the first sign of what he called integrated empathy: feeling without fixing, understanding without absorbing, loving without losing oneself. He likened it to the alchemical image of the phoenix, not a symbol of triumph but of necessity. Fire consumes everything false, leaving only what cannot be destroyed. In the ashes, a new consciousness rises, one that no longer confuses love with sacrifice. For that fire had burned through her entire identity. Yet what emerged from the wreckage was not bitterness but wisdom. She began to move through the world with a kind of radiant stillness. People sensed her depth and either gravitated toward it or recoiled from it. Jung noticed how her mere presence disrupted those still bound by their own projections. He called this the mirror effect to the unconscious. The integrated empath is unbearable because they reflect everything others hide. In his later reflections, Jung admitted that this phenomenon frightened him. These individuals, he wrote, stand at the edge of what the human psyche can bear. Their clarity was both healing and isolating. They lived in a world of half-truths, yet could no longer participate in them. He observed that they often experienced archetypal fatigue, exhaustion, from seeing too much, from perceiving the invisible machinery of human behavior in constant motion. It was the burden of sight to see the web of projection, manipulation, and pain in every interaction, and to know it cannot be unseen. Yet, despite the weariness, M found purpose in her solitude. She began writing letters not to anyone, but to the collective human soul, as if speaking to those who might one day awaken as she had. Jung saw this as the natural next phase of individuation, when the self turns outward, not to seek approval, but to serve consciousness itself. Her suffering, he wrote, was no longer personal. It became archetypal. He began to believe that these sovereign empaths were not anomalies, but harbingers, seeds of a future psyche capable of holding both shadow and light without collapsing into either. Jung devoted years to studying this mystery, why some empaths, when broken, became ghosts, while others emerged as sovereign beings. He began categorizing what he saw: the dissolved empath who disappears into the pain of others until nothing of themselves remains, the armored empath who protects their heart by sealing it shut, the wounded healer who dedicates their life to helping but never truly stops bleeding, and the sovereign empath, the one who completes the circle, who feels the world yet remains whole within it. It was this last transformation that both awed and unsettled him. He wondered whether humanity was witnessing the evolution of empathy itself. The sovereign empath, Jung wrote, has crossed the boundary between instinct and awareness. They can stand inside another's storm without being moved by its wind. They sense lies not with suspicion, but with knowing. They offer compassion without attachment, love without need. What once wounded them has become their strength, not because they hardened, but because they integrated. The shadow they once feared is now part of their light. Jung called this archetypal wisdom, the kind of insight born not from intellect but from surviving one's own depths. Yet every evolution comes with cost. Many sovereign empaths, he noted, lived in profound isolation. They found ordinary relationships unbearable because they could feel every falsity behind words, every subtle manipulation hidden in kindness. It wasn't judgment, it was resonance. They simply knew too much. They existed in a higher frequency of consciousness where pretense could not survive. Jung compared it to returning from the underworld. Once you've seen what lies beneath the surface itself loses meaning. For some, this led to despair. For others, to freedom. Freedom came when they stopped mourning the loss of their old life. The empath who survives narcissistic abuse, Jung realized, cannot return to who they were because that self was built on illusion. Healing, therefore, is not restoration. It is metamorphosis. The chrysalis cannot become the caterpillar again, he wrote. The goal is not to be as you were before, but to become the being your suffering was sculpting you into. M came to understand this truth instinctively. She no longer sought belonging in the old ways. Her peace came not from being understood, but from understanding. She had learned to walk through the world as both participant and witness, anchored in compassion, yet detached from outcome. Jung's private notebooks from this period read almost like sacred texts. He described empaths like M as bridges between the unconscious and the divine souls who had endured disintegration to embody wholeness. They were, he wrote, living proof that consciousness evolves through suffering, not despite it. But he also warned of new dangers that awaited them. The danger of believing themselves enlightened, of mistaking clarity for superiority. The danger of perpetual healing, always seeking transformation, but never resting in being. The danger of isolation, becoming comfort a hiding place, disguised as transcendence. And perhaps most subtly, the danger of revenge, using insight not to heal, but to expose, to wound, to prove one's invulnerability. He designed what he called the shadow integration protocol to guide them past these traps. It began with acknowledgement, confessing their own capacity for selfishness, control, and deceit. Then came withdrawal, reclaiming every projection they had placed on the narcissist. Finally, boundary alchemy, learning conscious permeability, the art of remaining open without surrender. For those who reached the final stage, archetypal alignment awaited the realization that their suffering had not been meaningless, but initiatory, shaping them into the very medicine they once sought. To live from that awareness was to embody the archetype of the wounded healer, one who transforms pain into wisdom not only for themselves, but for the collective. M practiced these disciplines quietly. She learned to pause before absorbing another's pain, to ask, "Is this mine to carry?" She learned to listen without rescuing, to love without losing. Her empathy had become choice, not compulsion, and with each choice she felt less like a survivor and more like a mirror of life itself, feeling everything attached to nothing. Jung described her final state with reverent wonder. She has become a conscious vessel, holding the totality of human experience untouched, unbroken, and immeasurably kind. In his later years, Jung began to view the emergence of sovereign empathy as a signpost for humanity's psychological future. He saw in these individuals the prototype of a new consciousness, one capable of balancing depth of feeling with unshakable inner autonomy. They are bridges, he wrote, between what humanity has been and what it may yet become. For Jung, this was not metaphor. He believed that just as the psyche evolves through stages of childhood, adolescence, and adulthood, so too does collective consciousness evolve through suffering, and those who survive the crucible of manipulation and betrayal are, in a sense, its midwives. M's life after transformation was quiet but luminous. She no longer sought to teach or convince anyone. Her mere being was the teaching. When she walked into a room, it felt as though silence deepened, like the air itself remembered its own weight. People confided in her without knowing why. Jung called this archetypal presence, when an individual has so completely integrated their shadow that others unconsciously recognize them as whole. And yet he observed such wholeness can be unsettling. Those unready to face themselves often reacted to M with discomfort, even hostility. The light of her awareness exposed what others work tirelessly to hide. They fear her not for what she says, Jung wrote, but for what she sees. Still, Jung found in her evolution a quiet hope. He began to imagine a world where more people could attain this kind of consciousness, where empathy would no longer mean self-sacrifice, and sensitivity would no longer mean suffering. He dreamed of societies led not by dominance or deceit, but by discernment, guided by those who could feel without absorbing, act without projecting, and love without needing to possess. To him, this was not fantasy, but the natural direction of human evolution. When enough of us integrate the shadow, he said, we will cease wounding each other unconsciously. We will love consciously, and that will change everything. Yet, Jung never romanticized the path. He warned that the transformation into sovereign empathy was both sacred and perilous. The isolation could tempt one toward arrogance or despair. The burden of sight could harden into cynicism if not balanced by humility. He advised his patients and perhaps himself to cultivate what he called archetypal humor, the gentle laughter born of recognizing the cosmic absurdity of the human condition. True sovereignty, he said, is never solemn. It carries wisdom, lightly aware that even insight is temporary, that life will always remain partly unknowable. M seemed to understand this intuitively. She lived simply tending a small garden near the lake. Visitors described her as radiant but grounded. She could speak of the darkest human behaviors without bitterness, as though she had made peace with the entire spectrum of existence. When asked how she endured so much pain and still remained kind, she smiled and said, "Because I stopped confusing pain with punishment." It was initiation. Jung underlined those words in his notebook and added only two more. She is free. In his final reflections, Jung wrote that every empath stands at a crossroads between destruction and metamorphosis. The narcissist, that shadow teacher, will either consume them or forge them. The difference lies not in the cruelty inflicted, but in what the empath chooses to make of it. The poison and the medicine, he said, are the same substance. Only consciousness determines the dose. He came to believe that humanity's collective survival might depend on learning this truth, that suffering, when faced with awareness, becomes the raw material of evolution itself. And so Jung's dangerous discovery was never about trauma alone. It was about what trauma makes possible, a level of consciousness that transcends the old dichotomies of victim and perpetrator, healer and wounded. The sovereign empath is the living embodiment of that transcendence, proof that the psyche can turn agony into wisdom, collapse into clarity, and heartbreak into a deeper form of love. They remind us that empathy need not be weakness. It can be the quiet strength that holds the world without losing the self. If you have walked through darkness and found yourself seeing with new eyes, if you have learned to love without drowning, to feel without breaking, then perhaps you too are becoming sovereign. Let your transformation serve as light for others still in the storm. If this journey spoke to you, share your reflections below. Like, subscribe, and join me in exploring the hidden architecture of the soul, where suffering becomes alchemy and empathy becomes evolution.